for joining us today. ESC exists to help other nonprofits be successful. We've been around for almost 40 years, and we employ about 150 volunteers a year working with nonprofits like yourselves, like your own. And we work on things, we assist organizations do strategic planning, marketing, fund development programs, improve governance, improve outcome measurements, and a variety of other topics. We also have a program where we provide interim leadership support or direct operation support. And those are stipended positions within your organizations. So if you'd like to talk to us about consulting or fellowships, we're here. Lynn, I'll introduce the staff that I see. Catherine Cruz is our Director of Communications. You've been hearing from her about this workshop. Donna Morell is our Director of Fellowships. Willia Cooper is our Director of Virtual Learning. Lynn Post is our Director of Consulting. And I think Nadella is somewhere here. And Nadella is our marketing, she's not. She's our Talent and Program Coordinator. Hi, Herb. So it was Herb that joined us from the Solomon Foundation. So we're very pleased to see all of you here today. I think we have a really important topic today. And so it's my pleasure to tell you a little bit about Cassandra Clay, who will be our presenter today. She's been with us as an ESC consultant for about 12 years. She is an expert in providing consultation and coaching on systems improvement in nonprofit organizations. And in addition to her consulting and coaching, she has a clinical practice and is a clinical professor emerita at Boston University School of Social Work. Cassandra serves on several boards and on our DEI committee. And I think that you're going to find this an amazing workshop. You will get out of it what you put into it. Her board work includes Institute of Health and Recovery, Metro Housing Boston, and the Boston University Board of Advisors. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Cassandra Clay. Take it away, Cassandra.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie, and thank ESC for being interested in this work and encouraging others to think about it. So hopefully we will dialogue together today to the extent possible in a Zoom format. I will be encouraging you to use chat also as a way to dialogue, and I think Julie and some other of the ESC staff will be monitoring the chat. You can unmute when there are opportunities to ask questions or to make an observation or a contribution. So I think we should get started. And so this workshop title of Cultural Humility, a relationship building framework for working in organizations. I should say that this framework is a framework that can be used for working with individuals in organizations, or it's a framework that can be used to look at organizational culture or to work within the larger. So it is a micro or macro kind of model that can be used in both situations. Next slide, please. So when we think of cultural humility, we compare it to some extent, and many of you are familiar, I can imagine, with some of this material and have heard about the notion of cultural competency. And so I really find that we're kind of comparing the differences. And obviously I have a preference for us thinking about it in a way that challenges us to consider cultural humility. I mean, cultural competency implies that one can function with a thorough knowledge of the mores and beliefs of another culture, while cultural humility acknowledges that it's impossible, really, to adequately be knowledgeable about cultures other than our own. And therefore, cultural humility really requires a curiosity, a willingness to be curious, a willingness also to be humble in our curiosity and to be respectful in our curiosity. Next slide, please. It was a concept that was originally developed by physicians, Melanie Tervalon and Jan Murray Garcia. It's not a new concept. It was developed over about 30 years ago, and actually originally was used primarily in medical settings, in the medical profession, and in the training of docs. Then it shifted a bit to also be used in public health. More recently, and I came to embrace the concept and to develop my own knowledge and skill in the concept as a social worker. More recently, it's been thought to be applicable in other organizational settings, and particularly in nonprofit management. It is a practice, and I can't emphasize that enough. It is a practice, much like yoga is a practice. And so we have to do it over and over and over again to get comfortable with it. There is no perfection. We're simply trying to do our best. It is a practice for people to deal or to look at hierarchical relationships. It is a practice that is used to help people in changing organizational policies. And it's a practice to help people build relationships based on trust. What is its significance for us, particularly in the nonprofit world? I think the significance is that often we are needing to do an organizational culture assessment of our organization. What cultural components are we bringing to the organization, both as an employee or as an employer? It can be used, and this is significance for dealing with or working through cultural differences associated with varied social identities of members of the organization. It also is significant because it can help us think about cultural conflict or dissonance that emerges during a work project that we're doing. And it can help us be more successful in working cross-culturally. So I think those are the reasons we are considering it in this context today. Next slide. Here I want to emphasize that a lot of times when we talk about culture, we talk about culture as though it belongs to other people and not ourselves. And I really want us to embrace today that culture is about us. And therefore, cultural humility requires an enormous amount of self-reflection. It is not other, or it is not just other, it is us. And so what are the various components? And there can be lots of components, but we just listed here a few. Culture can include how we're educated, how we identify in terms of race, ethnicity, nationality, the role of gender or sexual orientation, the role of religious orientation, how we are trained professionally is a part of our culture, the role of social class. You may hear sometimes this referred to as our social identities, and that all of us have multiple social identities, and that those social identities given context and given particular settings, one social identity may have more prominence than another, but that all of our social identities help inform how we present ourselves, how we are in our organizations. Next slide. So this is an opportunity to reflect a little, and if folks are comfortable, either you can put it in chat, but it would be great if a couple of people unmuted themselves and wanted to share. It asks us to think about a time one of your social identities worked as an asset on a work project within your organization, or it was an obstacle in your ability to carry out your work. And I will start by sharing something that came back to my mind recently. I was asked to do a set of parent engagement workshops in the Boston Public Schools. And these parents were identified as being enthusiastic about their children's education, wanting to be change agents, wanting to be involved in the school. I was introduced as a social worker. And I originally didn't think much about that, and I guess assumed it was an asset. But what I came to discover in session 2 was that it was a potential obstacle, because many people in the room had associated social workers primarily with the Department of Children and Families, and felt that, and wondered therefore, what was my real role? How much could they trust disclosing in the room, etc. So it ended up that my professional identity started out, I think, being an obstacle, and it was something that I had not originally thought about. Do we have other people who would like to share here, or are thinking about how your identity worked for you in your organization?
Cassandra, this is Willia. Could I also let people know, if you need to see the visual larger, if you click view and go to full screen, you can see the wording clearer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'll share something that comes to mind for me. Just going back a ways, this must have been late 80s, the summer of 89, when there was a lot of public attention around the stop and frisk policy of the Boston Police of youth of color. And the organization that I was with, which was a legal organization, developed materials to advise youth on what their legal rights were in the situation of a stop and frisk. And we also had some people who were from, I was not from that community directly. We had people from the community who also talk about the reality of, there's the legal reality, and then there's the what you do to stay alive reality, you know, advice in that picture. And although I was not much older than the people that we were doing the training for the benefit of, the fact that I was not of the same, I'll say racial, but I don't like the word racial background, created a distance, you know, that there was just no way that I could bridge it, because I also didn't live in the community. So that was something I was.
Yeah, absolutely. Other comments? I see some things in chat.
Yes, I was going to share that Amy, is it Mazur, is addressing appearance and age. She says her gray hair can connote wisdom or make her invisible, depending on the context, neither of which are accurate in all contexts.
Okay, absolutely.
Another one is from the historic Newton to everyone. As a lesbian, I have certainly experienced obstacles in the workplace, although thankfully few in number. It's helpful to her or him because now with all of the outreach going on in the community and the emphasis on DEI, this person is a member of the in-group.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
And Lynn had her hand up before, but now she's, I think, posted. Did you want to add to that, Lynn, or was that the what we see in the chat?
It's what we see in the chat.
Okay.
But what I thought was an obstacle feels like it's an asset.
I
now.
would say the same is true for me.
Right. So what Lynn has is, I believe in the past, my age over 60 was an obstacle to working with organizations with much younger employees. But now at ESC, an organization of mostly retired volunteer consultants, I believe my age is an asset.
Wow.
And then there's another one from Scott. As an older white male working with millennials, I need to remember that they don't see me as the 30-year-old I think I am. True. Just stop looking in the mirror, Scott. And is it Evelise? My lived experience is an asset to family engagement efforts.
Great.
Sure.
Thank you for those. And keep, if people have other ideas, let's get them in chat. But I think that people are capturing the ways in which it can be sometimes both an asset and an obstacle, or at different times be one or the other. And this again is the practice of what? This is the practice of self-reflection. Thinking about that at the individual level. Next slide, please. So I wanna just shift us a bit, because that exercise asked us to think about social identity as individuals. And I want now to have us think about culture and organizations, because organizations also have their own culture. And organizational culture is often not named or made explicit. I don't think in most organizations that we work in or we go into that anybody says to us, here's the culture of our organization. Sometimes we get to look at organizational values, which give us a bit of a hint about culture, but there are a lot of things that actually are not said. An organization's culture is usually driven by history or legacy, or driven by those who have the most power and authority. Challenge to an existing organizational culture is usually met with resistance. And I imagine most of us are familiar with that notion and may have been sometimes in the position of trying to challenge or to shift some organizational culture. Next slide. So in that light, I want to share with you some of the ways in which corporate organizational culture characteristics, which are often seen as white male centric. And why white male centric? Because corporate America, for the most part, probably 98.5%, has been dominated by white males. And so it would not be surprising that that orientation is the one that drives a corporate cultural orientation. And again, some of these characteristics are really never made explicit, but let's think about them. Among them, a sense of urgency, quantity over quality, individualism, worship of the written word, only one right way, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, objectivity, individualism, either or thinking. And I might just offer up some antidotes for some of them. For instance, the sense of urgency. What's the antidote to that? Realistic work plans, leadership that understands that things take longer than one expects, setting goals for diversity and inclusivity, particularly in terms of time, knowing that if you want to be inclusive, if you want to be diverse, it may take you longer. What about the antidote for quality over quantity, including process equality goals in your planning, developing a way to measure process goals, learning to recognize that those times when you need to get off the agenda in order to address people's concerns. What were some of the antidotes to individualism? Evaluating people based on their ability to delegate to others. Evaluating people based on their ability to work as a part of a team to accomplish shared goals. So just giving you varied antidotes to some of these culture characteristics that many of us actually work in, but may not think of them as a particular cultural orientation. Next slide, please. So I wanted to ask, what organizational characteristics were a part of your training and work experience? What organizational culture orientation might you be bringing to your current work environment? And again, I want to suggest, and for me personally, that I certainly was trained in that list that we had earlier, but for a long time didn't recognize that is not the only way to behave or to work in an organization. So I'm curious about either, again, put in chat, or if a couple of people wanted to speak about the organizational characteristics that have been a part of their training and work experience.
Are there any hands up? Please take yourself off mic, as it's hard to sort through 65 people.
Yeah, also Cassandra, this is Donna. While people are thinking about that, James McKim has a comment in chat where he's asking about the word antidote that you use. He's saying, is antidote the right word? Is there value or no value to any of the characteristics in that list? Do you want to comment about that?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think what I'm suggesting is an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Herb does have his hand up. Herb Nolan. Go ahead, Herb.
Hi, this is really great. Thank you for letting me in. I come out of the consulting world. I'm a designer, I'm a landscape architect, worked in large firms, and those firms, time is money, right? You've got to move along, you got to produce a product, you got to solve your clients' questions or problems quickly. Even if you don't solve them, even if you end up with something that's not quite right, it's got to wow them. So there is an urgency built into the for-profit world, which I think is very much part of how I operate in the nonprofit world. And that's just a fact.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yes, absolutely. But one can imagine, for someone who has been in the nonprofit world and has been working with an alternative set of values or an alternative environment, that when a consultant comes in and says, we have to urgently solve this, and we have, you have 2 weeks to make a decision.
Exactly.
You might understand what the tension and the frustration could be.
We experience it. Yep.
We do have a couple of entries in the chat. Alyssa Hurley, I trained in academia, which is very individualistic. Sometimes a challenge to think about work and productivity as collaborative or collective.
Absolutely, absolutely. Elizabeth, I was also trained in academia, and absolutely. In fact, there's you're looked down upon if you are publishing jointly. The goal is that all of your publications be single authored in order to have more prestige.
Yeah, we might not have this vaccine that is allowing us to get out in the world right now if people hadn't rejected that thinking.
Right. Absolutely.
Nikki, a challenging cultural norm that was a part of an organization she had been with. Oops, don't go away, this comment. The martyrdom piece, as if that was required. You expected that the work and mission was your first priority, not your own life and not your family's.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this organizational characteristic has been such a rub in recent time for a younger generation, particularly who are also parents, and for whom that cultural characteristic really was a way of evaluating whether people were committed to the organization.
No, they can't hear me.
Yes.
No, I'm muted. I just.
No, you're not muted.
Okay, why don't we move to the next slide? We'll can do some more thinking about that. Okay. I just want to see if so if we think about some of the skills that are involved in becoming, using cultural humility framework. What is it? And we talked about this a few minutes ago, an ability to assess oneself and one's limitations, including how we have been trained. So again, you see this emphasis on self-reflection, not just looking at other people's culture, but assessing ourselves and our limitations. An ability to acknowledge gaps in our own knowledge. And this is where curiosity becomes an important element, to recognize that because of our own cultural orientations, we may not know certain things. And an openness to new ideas, contradictory information, and advice. So those are the kinds of skills that I think we bring to this work when we're using a cultural humility framework. Next slide, please.
And Cassandra, before you start the next slide, I'd like to point out an interesting comment from Alison Clark, who she works with a global health organization. The majority of her colleagues are in East Africa, and they're constantly thinking about how and what to value in employee contributions. They're donor funded with high expectations for written reports and often expect certain quality that's Western based, even of colleagues whose primary language is not English.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think that is just a nice segue to this example. So if we could take a minute to look at this, a consulting team, both of whom have extensive experience in the corporate sector, have been contracted to assist with the strategic plan for a small nonprofit providing early child care education and services to elders in a working class neighborhood in Boston. Funders, and this gets back to the money piece that was highlighted earlier, are asking for a theory of change, a more robust financial accounting system, and a 3-year plan. During the information gathering stage of the project, team members discover, that is, the consulting team members discover that the organization uses a very relational model as opposed to a transactional model for getting their work done. This relational model emphasizes the need to get perspectives of multiple stakeholders, regardless of position in the organization, moves slower in any decision-making process, and often uses influence rather than positionality to get things done. Next slide. The consulting team and the client are frustrated. What do you think might be happening here? People have thoughts? And I think that earlier comment really segued into this.
Cultural conflict is happening here.
Cultural conflict is happening. Say more. Yes.
Hey, Cassandra, we're being asked to show that slide, the previous slide again.
Oh, okay.
Well, it sounds like the funders have a vision. The corporate consulting team has a process that is related to the funders' vision, perhaps more than to the relational model that the nonprofit is using. And so the results that are being measured for each of the 3 parties are very different. And the value of those outcomes is very different for each of the 3 parties. So there is a conflict of values.
Thank you. Yeah. And therefore frustration. And interesting, and this will come up in another slide, about not knowing how to name it. Because I think you're right that there's some conflict, some cultural conflict, and how do we name that and talk about it? Other thoughts? Other people been in a similar situation?
I'm
I Go ahead.
I think maybe the opposite situation where, where there already is more of a transactional model as opposed to a relational model. And oh, sorry about this. And so, but people want to go back to the relational model. And so that, but maybe under the relational model, things do go more slowly, and decision making is very slow, which prevents the organization from actually being successful.
Yes, that is possible.
Yeah.
And how, I think the question, the challenge is then how do you bridge that?
Yeah.
And how do you
bridge
that without shaming or without respecting the relational model, but recognizing that it may come with certain challenges.
Cassandra Evelise has her hand up, as did Herb.
Okay. Who wants to
Evelise?
go first?
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if I was first or if her. Okay.
Oh, yes, sorry.
So my organization faces this kind of thing quite often. We're very grassroots and we're parent-led. We're not philanthropists. We're not, we don't have a background in community organizing. However, we are effective because we also take that relational model, right? Our lived experience is what guides us, what leads us, and we're able to connect with people because we share those experiences. But when it comes to trying to find sponsors, funders, people to really invest in us, we have to have that language. We have to be familiar with the discourse community in order for them to really want to invest in us. And so I feel like there's a disconnect in cultural translation, because we can easily just translate the wording or the language to what's impressive for them, but why should we have to? Right? Like if we tell you, how we do the work and why we do it, why does it matter that it's not in that quote unquote language? So we run into this quite often.
Excellent point. Yes. And one can be resentful that one has to shift the language to get the money. I think the question would be, or something to think about, what is the role here of the consultant as a bridge? Not just the consultant as also coming with their corporate mindset, which might be more aligned actually with the funders, but how can they be a bridge to help the small grassroots nonprofit?
Right.
Okay, why don't we move forward to the next slide?
Do we have time for Herb's question or not?
Oh, yes, absolutely, Herb.
Well, I won't go into depth, but it reminds me of the adage, go slow to go fast. We're caught between, we are funders, but we're also funded by much larger funders. And we have a series of benchmarks that we're supposed to hit every single year. We're supposed to deliver things. So there's a lot of pressure. And I've been in a community now having conversations for 3 years, time well spent, but didn't meet the expectations of the people funding us. And so maybe that's a healthy tension. We do want to get results ultimately, but if we press too quickly or try to press too quickly, we can just lose the whole thing. I mean, that we can lose trust and faith, and nothing happens at that point. So
thank you, Herb. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what are the implications for us? Again, a willingness to assess ourselves with attention to social identity dimensions, and speak to what is sometimes the elephant in the room, which is to speak to the cultural conflict or the values conflict, to name it so that we can figure out how to move forward. Another implication, gaining comfort in naming either racial, gender, age, all those social identities and other differences, being able to name it, not skirt around it, not avoid it, but be able to name it and say that this may be part of what we're struggling with. Differences in lived experiences may explain how we have different worldviews, etc. And then gaining comfort also in observing and naming where there are similarities or shared characteristics. Because remember that there can be social identity similarities as well as differences, and the similarities can work as assets.
Right.
Next slide, please.
Cassandra,
Yes.
do you think in building teams, it's useful to perhaps focus initially more on shared similarities to get people feeling commonalities they might not be aware of?
Oh, I absolutely. I mean, I think both. I think an exercise, particularly in team building, is an exercise that asks us actually to take some time rather than the first meeting being product driven. The first meeting being how are we similar? How are we different? Both in terms of our past work experiences, but in terms of various social identity areas. So I think equally both, that you
Okay.
want to talk about both.
Thank you.
Other implication, acknowledge gaps in knowledge, which means allowing sufficient time for sharing of personal or organizational history of employees, colleagues, or clients and consumers who receive service. So again, this is about the conflict sometimes we see between kind of the corporate culture, we need to get things done quickly, and allowing sufficient time, because remember, this is a model that emphasizes relationship building. We need time in order to gain knowledge about others. Allow space to hear about personal or client resilience, strength, vision, goals, connections to social identity communities. Again, allowing space in which these things can emerge as a way of relationship building.
Cassandra, Scott has a good question.
Okay, Scott.
How do you recommend approaching naming without feeling like or being perceived as blaming?
Oh. Well, naming is, and maybe naming isn't the right word. Naming is wondering out loud what might be happening, or how in fact are we similar, how in fact are we different, what exactly might be going on. What are the varied ways? What ideas do we have? So again, leaving space, not necessarily dictating, but allowing people to share multiple perspectives, and in fact, inviting that in a very respectful way. Scott, do you have other ideas, Scott?
Sorry. No, that was helpful. Thank you. I guess sometimes it's the challenge is, how do you approach it? Unless there's a explicit situation,
right?
Where it is asked, that's helpful, because then of course you feel free to share. But I mean, if you see things, sometimes it's difficult to bring it up. I mean, I mentioned the joke about millennials earlier. I mean, that could be, I could see sharing it with peers, but if you're, sort of in a interpersonal situation, I'm not sure ways to approach it without seeming blamey or anything like
that. Okay. Well, let's come back to that in a minute. Maybe in the questions we pose. And then the final one is ask directly. What questions am I not asking? What else is important for me to know? Whose voices are missing? And I particularly like, when I'm working organizationally, to always center that question. Whose voices are missing? Who's not in the room? Who's not being represented? Next slide.
Pat Shirky has an interesting comment.
Pat?
I've always felt that meetings were, or Pat, do you want to say it to the group?
No, probably. You can just read it, Julie.
Okay. I've always felt that meetings were essential in building a team and trust, a common goal and language, but I find that people are often too busy to meet, find meetings boring, and that they are time wasters. Can you suggest a substitute for meetings to lay this groundwork for teamwork? So I think, Pat, you're referring to the groundwork that is in fact the getting to know one another, the sharing of similarities as well as differences.
Yes, and
Yeah, well, I think actually in this next slide at the bottom, there's increasing offline communication between meetings. So yeah, meetings are not always the best way, particularly if they're quite structured and have a lot of report out. Now, I think there are ways to organize meetings and to allow in the first 5-7 minutes of the meeting to be more relational, for people to feel that they can get to know each other a little and have that as a standard part of any kind of agenda. And we could talk about that more if we have time. Okay, if I could just go through this last, I think, slide before we get to some questions. Openness to new ideas, adjust language to better communicate, but avoid being condescending. So I'm in the consulting world and we sometimes use focus group as focus group language. But I work with an organization recently who didn't like that term. It felt too corporate, it felt too researchy, and they wanted to use the language of conversation circle. SWOT analysis, which many of you are familiar with as consultants probably, strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats. Again, the organization didn't like the word threats and said, why can't we call it concerns? So being willing to shift the language. Again, openness to new ideas. Staff client appreciation, in fact, might be money instead of a gift card or instead of a luncheon. Other new ideas include embracing and joining in the welcoming style of the working group, increasing offline communication, asking about ways to better understand the organization or the individual. So we're just highlighting some new ways, possibly breaking out of our old ways of thinking and some new possible ways of thinking about working more effectively. Next slide. So that brings us now to a set of questions we might want to reflect on before we end. You know, what do you think led to your biggest success or your biggest failure in working cross-culturally? What is the hardest thing to shift for you, given the organizational cultures in which you were trained? And then what challenges and opportunities do you see for your organization, given increased interest and demand for DEI knowledge and skills? And I think we'd like to open it up here for you to talk about any of these questions or any of these thoughts or a reflection you've had during our discussion today. And again, I will rely on my colleagues to watch the chat and watch the hands.
Sometimes we learn the most from failures. I don't know if anybody's willing to share a failure. Or what they're seeing in their organization as the hardest challenge right now to shift the organizational culture away perhaps from the way you were trained?
I think people are thinking.
Yeah, these are provocative questions we're asking.
I don't know if anybody wants to share what their organization is doing actually, given the increased interest and demand for DEI knowledge and skills. Because I think there's some good work beginning to happen.
This is Sarah Conrad. I think one of the biggest learnings I had that probably led to some different failures, but was around the different orientations people have around trust, and whether or not you sort of assume trust until someone loses it, or there's an expectation that someone will build trust before you give it to them, sort of speaking. And so just thinking about you know, that has a lot to do with that relationship. And so the differences in recognizing that people are coming at that differently was a really valuable learning for me.
And that trust means different things to different people, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is Willia. I don't necessarily see this as a particular opportunity just for ESC, but I know I've been reached out to in the last 6 months by friends and colleagues, white friends and colleagues who are trying to get more people of color onto boards and into their organizations to see if I can help them to connect to other people who could help to do that. And one of the things I've observed or suggested was changing the language. The language that the organization uses doesn't always resonate in, particularly for me, the African-American community. And another piece of advice that was given was patience. That community tends to be relationship driven first. So you can't go in with your facts and figures and what you're doing is saving the world and don't you want to be a part of it. That doesn't really work. And I don't know if this is helpful or not, but it just came to mind since that's happening quite a bit.
Thanks, Willia.
And Herb Nolan has his hand up. And there are
but Willa, we want to save the world. We all want to save the world.
I do too.
I know. Oh God, yeah, guilty as charged. I just remember bringing in a really cool idea to a group, and they thought I had 3 heads, you know, and I did.
Now, don't forget, I wasn't blaming anybody.
Yeah. Oh my God. But we are going through this. Well, we've all been going through a growth period. Let me put it that way. Even at our advanced years, never too late to learn. But it does come back to the relationship building, and it's so difficult to actually put in the time to do that.
Yes.
So it's like, I guess it's going to be quality, not quantity. You just got to make it count when you show up and you're real with folks, and you don't start in on solving the particular problem you think you're there to solve. You may have that wrong. You may be solving the wrong problem. So we are definitely shifting over to a much more of a relational kind of, I mean, it's a much richer and more interesting way to go at it. It just takes a lot of spade work, and I'm spending much more time now.
Right.
Not even talking about the problem at hand. It's just like, who are you? What's going on? Those are just beginning questions,
Yeah, I quoted you in chat a little bit.
Okay. All right.
And Ray Ruth, do you want to expand on the comment that you put in chat? It's very observant, and I think many of us probably are experiencing similar situations.
Yeah, I I'm a young professional and a new employee. Just kind of like building on my experience, and I think it's really, really challenging to lead up in the way of like changing the culture, because when you come into an organization, people believe that their culture is the right way and that they're doing it the best, the way that they believe is best. But what I've found with my organization is figuring out that as I get more ingrained in the culture, realizing that everything I was maybe told coming in isn't necessarily what's happening. And so just figuring out ways to lead up and figuring out ways that I can like change how I do things so that it can eventually lead, show others, but it's challenging. It's really, really challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm appreciating what you said about once you're there, discovering that the culture may be different than it was initially described.
Is it okay if I say something?
Yes, Ellen.
Yeah. So I also found that when you get into situations where people are working as a team or trying to be work together, that there are the doers and the talkers. So that could be a cultural, that could be sort of like a way you are, but there are a lot of people who do a lot of talking, but don't take any action. And then there are people who take action, but don't do a lot of talking. So that to me is a particularly hard hurdle to get over a lot, because people just love to, yap, and sometimes you'll get some good ideas coming out of that. But when it comes time to implementing them, that's the hard part. If they don't follow through on their ideas, then and if somebody who is maybe more of a doer doesn't follow through on them, that is when you end up with sort of conflict in organizations, I think. And I don't know if any of you have had experiences with that as well.
Well, I think that gets to the notion of organizational, expectations and what is valued. And if it's a doer culture, then a product, if a product is particular, a written product is what is essential or what is highly valued, and you have people that are more talkers or more relational, may not have the same skill sets in writing up or documenting, then you sort of have to figure out what assets do different people bring. Not that those people who don't do the writing necessarily are labeled as lazy or inefficient, but they may not have, in fact, the same skill sets. So yeah, I can see how that would be, that can definitely be a team conflict.
Well, we're close. We are a couple of minutes over. We started officially at 2:04, so I think we're at our 2-hour moment. I thought Scott's last comment was also a good suggestion. Perhaps making the discussing of differences a part of the culture versus an event could assist. A few people modeling this sort of discussion day to day could go a long way.
Great. Well, I would like to thank you for participating in this dialogue. And it is a dialogue. Cultural humility is a practice. We don't get to it is not about perfection. It is about working at it. It is about being intentional in our engagement with others. So thank you so much. Every time I participate in one of these, I learn from you. And so I have found this discussion to be particularly helpful. Thank you, and thank ESC.
So thank you everyone for joining us today. This was an important opportunity, I think, for us to consider an important topic, to think of it personally and organizationally and as a community of nonprofits and foundations. So thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Cassandra. I know that this is a topic that you are well versed in and able to, I think, help us all begin to build in cultural humility as a practice or grow it if it is already part of our practice. So thank you. And I want to thank my team, Catherine Cruz for setting this up, and my colleagues who are here with me. So thanks very much, everyone. We hope you will be in touch and support one another. I think we're going to be sending out a survey to get your responses, your feedback. So look for more programs from us like this in the future. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Cassandra.
Thank you.